You are now watching Zach Lesage, the best place to learn about competitive Pokemon TCG. Let's get it! What's poppin' peeps? Welcome back to the channel, Zach Lesage here. Today we're going to be going over the decks that did not make the top 10, the decks that are within that 11 through 20 range. So it's something that I've been doing over the past few weeks. Hopefully you've been enjoying it and understanding more of the general metagame in the Pokemon TCG. So, we got a lot of movement in these videos. I mean, the 11 to 20 range is the wild, wild west, so stay tuned for a bunch of really cool deck lists. I hope you really enjoy watching these videos, and all the decks are going to be in the pinned comment below, along with reference videos for most of them, so check that out. And if you're looking to pick up any of these decks online, you can go to PTCGO plug in code ZLesage5 to save 5% on your next order. That being said, let's jump into our number 20 spot. Starting it off hot at number 20 and falling from number 13 last week is Shadow Rider CALYREX VMAX. This deck's chilling at 20 CP. Putting into perspective, our number one spot, because we do feature that video first on Mondays, is Mew VMAX at 1620 CP. So if we're putting a difference between power, this Mew VMAX is almost 100 times as more successful as Shadow Rider. So while I do think Shadow Rider is a good deck, it is just not as strong as Mew VMAX in the formats. The goal is really just to Underworld Door, accelerate a bunch of energies, use Red Assist and Blue Assist to accelerate more energies, and that's the goal of this deck. I think it's a really fun deck. It's relatively budget nowadays, but it's not as successful as we're used to other decks, so keep that in mind. I think this deck is definitely a top 20 deck, and it could spike up to the top 10 if the format changed a little bit, but like I said, Mew VMAX is just a better Psychic deck right now. Here we are at number 19 with VIKAVOLT V. Now this is the type of deck that I wouldn't necessarily expect to see on the list, but Ryota Seda from Japan has been playing this deck to some decent success. I mean, decent success is one player can only do so much for one deck, but I do think VIKAVOLT V is a cool deck in all. The whole idea is to be a mid-range control deck with VIKAVOLT V's attack, using Inteleon's quick shooting to add some extra damage, Fan of Waves, and just accelerating energies with Melanie. It's a cute deck. I think that there's currently plenty of other better decks in the format, but if you are looking for something interesting, and when I say like, it's one of those things where this deck might be a gem. It might be a little bit dirty. This might not be the best list I've ever seen for a deck like this, but it is the type of deck that, like, while it did pop up this week, and we've seen other decks like Gardevoir and Blissey pop up into these spots where they got one or two placements by one player alone, I do think that there are opportunities to explore these decks and see exactly how the whole game goes. Do I think that this deck's going to make the top 20 list next week? Probably not. Decks like this usually are a flash in the pan, but I do recommend that you give it a try, see exactly what we have going on here. Hopping into our number 18 spot, not on the list before, is STONJOURNER VMAX. I was actually quite surprised when I saw that STONJOURNER VMAX has made our top 20 list, but it seems like Vinny Fernandez has seen some success with this deck, and it didn't necessarily make the top 20 list with that success, but then we had a few other players play this deck, and this week we saw it a little bit more solidified and streamlined. Less decks means that a smaller amount of placements allows STONJOURNER VMAX to flourish. That being said, this deck is all about using heal and damage reduction between the Stone Fighting energy and this Zamazenta V, while also healing with your STONJOURNER, Hyper Potion, Team Yell Towel, Lucky Ice Pop. It's kind of a weird mid-range control deck that just doesn't necessarily seem as good as Duraludon VMAX. To me, I think this is the type of deck that's going to be a flash in the pan, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about it too much, but it is interesting enough. Fun fact, I almost played this deck for Oceania Internationals 2020, the one where I actually came second with Reshiram and Charizard GX. But ultimately I did not play it and decided to play the fire type deck instead, and placing second at international championships. I think this deck reminds me of Primal Groudon. It just doesn't necessarily get there for me or have the same kind of oomph as that deck. So I think this deck is again going to be placed relatively low on this list next week, if not making it at all. Hopping into our number 17 spot and falling from 14th last week is SYLVEON VMAX. SYLVEON VMAX is all about putting a different bunch of Pokemon in play that are all different types to really hit with its attack. Now, these Pokemon can also be used in different matchups, as we can see that we have Galar and Moltres for Darkness type weak matchups, and we have Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX for decks that are weak to fighting, stuff like that. So the deck does have ways to get around other popular matchups. However, it does seem to crumble altogether, which is why Sylveon just doesn't necessarily seem to be seeing as much success. So as other decks such as Single Strike have ways that unify them or make them a little bit tighter, Sylveon VMAX does not necessarily have all Rapid Strike Pokemon. You can see Galarian Moltres V does not have necessarily that Rapid Strike stamp on it. These are really things where it does make the deck a little bit inconsistent, why it's not necessarily seeing as much success. If we do get some Rapid Strike Pokemon that we could throw into this deck, I do think that this deck could be a huge success, but between the lack of energy acceleration and just the playing kind of 3-4 different kind of decks in one does make this a little bit worse. I would recommend, if you do like Sylveon, to play Galarian Moltres with Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX as its own deck. I think that might be a little bit more successful for you. At number 16, and moving up a couple spots from last week, we have Dragapult VMAX. Now, Dragapult VMAX is a strong deck overall, but I do think it's the type of deck that does struggle a little bit by having no Intelli online. Obviously, the deck needs to fit in all these cards like Path to the Peak, Crushing Hammer, Fan of Waves, Pokemon Catcher, all these things that Lee Bui usually puts in these kind of single VMAX decks. But that does also hurt its consistency a little bit because Kabu only goes so far. While I do think that this deck does have a fair chance at beating decks like Mew or even Jolteon and other decks within the metagame, they're also incredibly fragile, so that's why they rank relatively low, and other decks like Victini kind of fluctuate. I mean, Victini's seen a little bit of a resurgence, and it will go up to like a number 10 spot and fall back down because it does well against Duraludon and Turbo Zacian. But this deck it's good, it's not bad. A lot of people wonder where Dragapult's at. It's good, it's not bad, it's just not the best right now. Number 15, the halfway point of the top 20 deck list. This deck had a huge fall from number 9 last week. Victini VMAX seems, it's kind of the same thing that we just went over with Dragapult, except you're going Victini VMAX, Max Victory instead of using Dragapult VMAX, right? It's one of those things where the core of the deck is same, the deck list creator is the same at Lee Bui. Decks like this, again, are incredibly fragile. I think Victini is the better of the two decks. It does have better matchups against decks that feature Pokemon V VMAX, and it does have ways against some of the top decks like Duraludon and Turbo Zacian, stuff where you can do pretty well. I think that this is a cool deck. We'll just have to see how it goes in the future. Like, Victini seems like it's going to kind of maybe see a little bit of play, spike a tournament here or there, maybe do okay, but not necessarily get there. So I think this is relatively like a 15 to like 10 deck. The fact that it's got the number 9 is pretty huge for it. There's just so many other better decks that I think are cool, and I think a lot of decks can kind of have this VMAX treatment and be in this similar position where you could spike a tournament, but it's not necessarily going to be as sticky as other decks. Number 14, and dropping all the way from number 11 last week, is SUICUNE Ludicolo. What was once considered one of the best decks in the format has fallen in this kind of middle range deck of the underplayed decks, and it's just because it doesn't necessarily get there. It doesn't knock out Mew VMAX. It loses to Jolteon. It has a back and forth match with Single Strike. Duraludon can really give you some trouble because of your capture energy. Ice Rider pretty much has a favorable matchup against you. Zacian is very close. You lose to any Rapid Strike Urshifu variant just because they can take off their Lotads and their Sobbles. I mean, you don't necessarily lose, but it's unfavorable. I would imagine that the Baby Galarian Moltres is tough. Gengar is tough. Like, you could see, like, out of the top 10, like, you maybe do okay against Single Strike, and you maybe do okay against Duraludon. Those aren't really the things that you want when it's looking at a deck. So again, this is the case of a deck that's doing very well in the format, a deck that is very well suited. It just does not do well with the other decks that are good in the metagame right now. It doesn't play nicely with them. So if those decks change, this deck can shoot up. But right now, this is the current best build that we have for the deck. I really expect this deck to be within this 15 to 10 range, similar to Victini. Hopping into number 13 and jumping all the way from number 19 is Malamar. Malamar is the type of deck that will spike a tournament and do well, get a solid result, but then it will not do very well within the top 16. Like, you're either doing very well with this deck or you are not. So Malamar to me seems like it's the definition of a run hot, a high risk, high reward deck. And it's all about using Rapid Strike Tentacles and taking cards in your hand, showing them to your opponent that are showing them that they're Rapid Strike, shuffling them back into the deck and kind of playing around with it. It does lead this deck to be naturally inconsistent, and I do think players have really taken the Baby Galarian Moltres Hoopa deck as the better single prize card deck. But Malamar can spike up and win events. I do think it's well positioned in this metagame. You are going to lose Rapid Strike Urshifu and Jolteon like most single prize cards decks will. But you do have a fighting chance against the metagame, and I think it's a worthwhile deck if you are balling on a budget or looking for something a little bit more unique. As much as this deck has fallen as low as number 19 on this list, I do think that the deck, I would consider Malamar a top 10 deck right now if I were to place it myself. Jumping into number 12 and jumping up from number 16 is LEAFEON VMAX. LEAFEON VMAX using Grass Knot to focus on your opponent's retreat cost with Galar Mine in mind. I mean, I think a deck like this is very good. Like a lot of the decks on this list, they're just good decks or decks that we've seen in previous formats, but they don't necessarily play nice for their current metagame. With Mew and Jolteon both having 0 retreat costs and other decks like Duraludon taking away your options for capture energy, I do think that this deck struggles in this metagame, and there's other decks that beat it too, but let's just name off like Mew and Jolteon being the number 1 and number 2 most successful decks in this format, and likely the number 1 and number 2 most played decks in these format. I think that LEAFEON VMAX just struggles so much. It is the type of thing where LEAFEON can pick up some solid finishes, especially if it hits like Single Strike and maybe a few other decks. Beyond that, it's just really one of those things where LEAFEON VMAX not properly suited for the metagame. Definitely a solid deck and one that we've seen a lot of success with in the past. I think, again, it's within this 15 to kind of 10 ratio where you could kind of go wherever you want, although it hasn't broke the top 10 in a minute. Here we are at number 11, the deck that just barely did not make the top 10 list. Jumping all the way from number 17 is SUICUNE v Inteleon. Now, this is the type of deck that's seen a little bit of success from a few players, Tate Whitetail namely being the player who's seen the most success with this deck. They seem to play this deck at events, do pretty well with it, although from what I can see, this is just kind of a hybrid of Ice Rider CALYREX VMAX as a basic Pokemon, having less HP, less damage output. I think that's where Ice Rider's seeing more success, and this deck's not necessarily seeing as much success. We have seen Tate play Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, or Rapid Strike Urshifu V, I should say, not VMAX, with the Rapid Strike energy to try to get around Jolteon. Jolteon's just going to be a tough matchup, so I think that the Ice Rider CALYREX VMAX that I featured in the top 10 that placed number 5 in the metagame is just a much better choice. Unless more players play this deck, I don't necessarily think it's going to break the top 10. SUICUNE LUDICOLO, I think, is a much more solid deck than this and is not necessarily seeing as much success. It's one of those things where this deck is probably going to stay within the 11 to 20 range, however it is. It just depends on playability. We'll see how that goes, but solid job to Tate and anyone else who's played this deck and seen success. And that's what we got going on for this video today, peeps. Hopefully you enjoyed learning more about the metagame. And again, like I said, all the lists are in the pinned comment below with reference videos for most of them. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you're totally welcome. I totally would appreciate it. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up. It does help support the channel and boost the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you haven't already. Double check to see if you haven't subscribed. We're so close to getting to the next step, and we'll see exactly where we go there. And stay tuned for a whole week filled with Pokemon TCG content. I'll check it with everyone else later. Peace out and have yourself a great day. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to watch this video. It means the world to me. And my goal with this channel is to spread my love of the game and knowledge with our entire Pokemon TCG community. If you haven't already, help signal boost this video to other Pokemon TCG fans by liking it, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing to the channel. Hopefully we reach our goals really soon. Check out this recommended video, and have yourself a great day. Thanks.